Yeah, that actually leads to the next thing that I wanted to talk about, and that is how gun control, like you were saying, well, I don't want the citizens to have weapons or arms or whatever, but
Hmm.
the government should totally have all the weapons to do whatever they're going to do with them. Um, so another aspect about this that I've found to be interesting, and this isn't like the first time that's happened. There's been other instances that this has happened, and I mean, it's sad that it has to come to this where children have to die, but right wingers and conservatives who were back the blue, I love the police, I'll support the police. They
Hmm.
should have they should have all the funding or whatever. They're coming around to the fact that yeah, maybe the police don't look out for my best interest. They don't look out to protect and serve me and the
Hmm.
citizenry or whatever. And it's definitely a white pill.
Hmm.
I think if people are starting to understand, and I'm not gonna be one of those like defund the police people or whatever. I'm gonna say how I feel about this is that because I think it was the amount of funding that they were getting. I think it was like 40% or something like that of the city's budget was going to the police. I'm pretty sure. If that's the case, then obviously if they had gotten 41% of the budget, then this wouldn't have happened, right?
Yeah.
Um, but it just goes to show that because some people were saying, well, I mean, they have families to they go home to. It's like, well, yeah, that's true, but so did the children that got shot and killed, and the teachers and all this stuff. And I think I think it's I think it's interesting because I look at it as like obviously I don't want the government to have the monopoly on violence. I don't want them to have the police, whatever. But I'm sure you agree that they're not going to go away tomorrow. So
Hmm.
what are some things that could possibly improve it? I'm not 100% sure. I don't have all the answers, but I would say if if these if the policemen had a better relationship with the citizens that they were supposed to be protecting, then I don't know, maybe the situation wouldn't have been as bad as it was. I don't know. Um, because clearly money isn't helping out. And I mean, I don't know, like eh, okay, so and I'm kind of rambling and going all over the place. But another thing that I want to say about this that I think because you're talking about how there's like two sides where it's either this one or that one. I've seen libertarians
Hmm.
say, well, the answer is you got to abolish public schools. Okay, yeah, I agree, but how are you going to get there? Like, how do you know, oh, well, if I become a president or whatever, if I become the mayor, I'm just going to abolish all the public schools in my area, in my jurisdiction. But I don't know, just having that type of like, just saying that as a solution is fine, but you're not telling people how you get there because when you just say that, it's just like, and I was one of those people who used to be like, yeah, abolish public schools. Like, that's the
Hmm.
answer. But now I'm kind of thinking a little bit more I don't know how to describe it, but like a little bit more like, okay, how do we get to that point? You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
Well, I mean, that's the $1 million question, right? And I know that as we're sitting here talking, there's this clown show convention happening out in Reno, and um, we're not talking about that today. All I was gonna, the only reason I brought that up is just to say that's the $1 million question for them and us and everyone else, isn't it? Is that now that you've done the thing you're doing, what's next? What's the thing you're going to do now? What are you going to do that's going to make actionable changes? Um, but I will say, because I love to shit on them all the time, but I will say in their or just generic Lawbert defense, if I may, is that you and I could sit here and we will. I can give you a short list of things that I would say if we did these things, and I think they're at least more realistic than me becoming president of the United States. These would move the needle forward. However, a lot of us have been around long enough to know that any list of things we come up with that would be a net positive these aren't new ideas. These ideas have been around for years, if not decades, if they never come to fruition because Leviathan's not interested in that. So even if our tactics are different, no matter who you are, and we could use the great Ron Paul as an example. Okay, so run as a Republican, get into Congress. Instead of trying to fight the duopoly, work within. You know what? That's been done before too. And we don't exactly live in paradise. I'm not saying that it wasn't great that he did it. I'm not saying that it didn't draw a lot of people to these ideas, but it was the drawing of people to ideas was really the success there. It wasn't actually making actionable change because Leviathan's not interested in actionable change. But more to your point, like, okay, let's talk real shop for a second, but not in complete fairy tale world of what could be done differently. So for one, we know that the police have no duty or obligation to protect us. That's been affirmed by the Supreme Court and held up several times in court. So hoping for better officers, hoping for more money, more training, more whatever, that makes absolutely no whit of difference whatsoever. If this is one of the reasons why people would be against the state have a monopoly on violence and having police be the only answer to a problem like this, precisely because they don't answer to us. They're not going to suffer any negative repercussions for their actions should they fail miserably, whereas private security would. But even that, you know what? Even that's a step too far. Let's reel it way back into what generic lefties and righties would understand. First of all, repeal gun-free zone laws. Throw those out the door. Those are absolutely ridiculous. Gun-free zone just means target-rich environment. That's all that means. It's all it's ever meant. The second thing would be if you're talking about specifically that town, and it's a small town. It's like 16,000 people live in that town. I don't want to get too hung up on this one example because it's a lot bigger topic than just this one example. But it is a good example. This one town is a town of 16,000 people, and yet that enormous percentage of their budget goes to their police force, and they've got these armored vehicles and SWAT teams, and they're just armed to the teeth. They are the true definition of militarized police. Something that we talk about at TAC all the time is you talk about asset forfeiture and equitable sharing, and how that then allows this huge exchange of money. By exchange, I mean stealing it from people, the feds getting it, and then sending a certain percentage of that back to the local municipality. That allows for this massive militarization of police. And what did that do to help those children? All that money and equipment and gear didn't do anything for those kids. So that can't, obviously, you're right, that can't possibly be the answer. So getting rid of like I said, getting rid of gun-free zone laws would be a help. Having a serious conversation, it's kind of like separating the serious from the non-serious. A non-serious conversation is let's get rid of guns. That's a non-serious conversation. Everyone who advocates for gun prohibition to end gun violence necessarily requires gun violence to get rid of gun violence. That is just an abject fact of their position. So that's just inconsistent from the word go. We could sit here and talk about how, teachers could be armed and trained. And you're right. I'm totally on board with abolishing public schools, but you're right. We don't have a magic wand. We're not going to abolish public schools tomorrow. But I would say, again, I feel compelled to defend the Lawbirds as autistic as they are, is that it's not that their position is wrong. It's just not something that we have the means to accomplish right this minute, or perhaps even in our lifetime. I read just recently from our friend Michael Bolden that it's really disingenuous to talk about having these types of freedom in our lifetime. It's more realistic to talk about laying the foundation for future generations. We're not going to dig out of this hole tomorrow. But, private schools, if you have a private school and they have private security, they absolutely would be required. I mean, it would be a part of their job description to protect your children. You're sending your children to that school, but it also applies to the public school. This is probably one of the most damning parts of the whole school shooting, school violence equation, which is you can't send your kid to school strapped. That's a quick way for him to get sent to jail or expelled forever. You can't go to school with your kid and protect him. They're not going to, I mean, we see how they treat parents. We see how they treat parents outside there. We see how they treat parents at school board meetings. You're not going to be allowed in there to do anything. So, but the point is that we have to have a logical consistency there. And if your kid can't protect himself, and if you can't protect your child, but your child must go to school, in the scenario where we're not talking about homeschooling, they must go to this local public school, then that means the responsibility of your child's safety has now fallen upon them. That, to put it nicely in a let's go burn down the local precinct way, that's the issue that we're faced with this recent example, is if you are not they have commandeered the responsibility of the defense of your child, which means they now own that responsibility. And then they also then turn around and failed at that responsibility. Therefore, in any sensible situation, someone must be to blame. Now, before anyone gets their feathers ruffled, yes, the gunman is to blame. That's the first person to blame, and that's never not true. That's never not true. It's not the gun. It's not necessarily anyone else. It's always the gunman first. But they still took your responsibility, your right to protect your child. They effectively stole that right from you. They now own that responsibility. They failed to do it. So there should be way less national conversation about how we're going to license and restrict firearms, and a way bigger conversation about how, if the state has commandeered certain responsibilities, that means they now own those responsibilities. If they're not fulfilling those responsibilities, then they are at fault. And at a minimum, those responsibilities should be returned to you. I'll add one more quick thing though before I turn it back over to you, because there's a million different examples we could bring up. Is you mentioned earlier that the right wingers that generally are seen as the copsuckers are starting to, at least some are starting to wake up and say, wow, this is not what I have always envisioned when I've thought of the thin blue line. I don't like what I'm seeing here. And that is a white pill, and that's great. Not that long ago, if you had told people, yeah, we're going to have some percentage of conservatism turning on police, I think a lot of people wouldn't have believed it. So that is good news. But and of course there's been plenty of people on the left that have been anti-cop for a long time. But they have to understand it. They have to be able to reckon with it. There has to be a logical consistency there. And the consistency there would be, if I don't trust the police, and if they're not doing the job that they're sworn to do, which again we know that legally they're not, to protect my children because I can't, then I as a parent should absolutely be evaluating ways that I can restore those rights and responsibilities to myself. And I'll give you one more somewhat not realistic, but more realistic than Dave Smith 2024, which is a lot of the problems we're seeing today started at I think it's 1979 or 1980 with the creation of the Federal Department of Education. Look, every state has a state Department of Education, and they've had one all along. It was with the creation of the Federal Department of Education, when federalism died and when the federal government took over the responsibility of education from the 50 states and started instituting curriculum, started instituting laws and regulations. Think people old enough to remember George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind and all that kind of garbage. That's how we get things like federal gun-free zone laws, because it's a federal law. Your local school can't just decide to throw those signs in the trash because the federal government instituted it. So, um, while it's probably not the most realistic thing, it's at least more realistic than ending the Fed, right? Federal Reserve is abolishing the federal Department of Education. Now, if you live in a shithole state and your state's Department of Education is less than ideal, then that sucks for you. But at least you can vote with your feet, right? But this is a perfect example where restoring federalism would at least help, not solve, but help some of the crisis that we're seeing, whether it's economic, social, cultural, or in this case, the matter of education and gun rights. Restoring federalism, getting rid of a federal Department of Education, and in my case, allowing the Tennessee State Department of Education, if it decides, well, we're going to have off-duty officers, although officers are shit. If we're going to have private security, we're going to work into our education budget a certain number of teachers that are going to be armed and trained in use of a firearm, that sort of thing. I mean, would that solve these problems? I don't know, but it's at least an actionable change that we could foresee happening that could potentially help the problem, that doesn't trample on the rights of other people, is not counter to things like the Second Amendment, and works within the confines of what you sort of presented, which is, we're still going to have public schools. People are still going to be sending millions of their children to these schools every day. We're not going to be able to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Again, sad to say, and I'll shut up and let you take back over. Sad to say is that, again, none of these ideas are new. I didn't come up with these things. These things have been discussed for decades, and they haven't happened. So another part of the national conversation has to be, if every single time there's a crisis, it's harumph, ban guns, harumph, keep my guns, the conversation will never move forward, because we're not even broaching any of these genuine actionable changes.
Yeah, so something I wanted to add to that, because you had mentioned George W. Bush, I looked up because someone had posted, I think it was like a Wikipedia screenshot of something about like this gun-free zone passage into law, and it was a Democrat who had introduced it, and then it was signed into law by H.W. Bush. So bipartisanship wins again.
Yep.
So I just wanted to add that little caveat to it. That was kind of funny. But then you also talked about arming teachers, and I was thinking, I mean, I don't know, because some of these teachers, I don't know if you trust them with the gun, if children don't have anything to defend themselves with, and the teacher decides, you know what, I don't want to teach anyone, I don't care. And maybe I'm going to like the ultimate worst case scenario, but I mean, I don't know, maybe that would be something that some parents would kind of be like, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that, because I don't know the teacher. I don't have a good relationship or good rapport with the teacher. I don't know. And then you hear some stories about teachers, kind of doing some disgusting things to children at the schools. You're just like, I don't know, teaching them some weird things. You're like, I don't know.
So, well, I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't trust the teachers to teach my children, much less protect my children from an insane gunman. But what I'm saying is that, but my feeling that, as you pointed out, my feeling that way, and even my keeping my kids out of the school, is not going to change the fact that teacher is going to go to work tomorrow with a million other kids.
Yeah, that's true. And also kind of talking about when you were mentioning homeschooling, or you weren't going to mention homeschooling, but like you kind of mentioned it, not talk about homeschool, but you mentioned it. That's what I was trying to say. That like homeschooling has been an uptick, especially with COVID and all that.
Yep.
But that's another indication where, just homeschool your kids. And I mean, we're planning on doing that with our children, homeschool our kids. But also at the end of the day, we, like you were just saying, we understand that there's going to be teachers who's going to be teaching however many other kids are going to go to that school, because a lot of parents, they don't have a choice, or they feel like
Hmm.
they don't have a choice. Like, I had to put my kid into the public school system because it's just more convenient for me. I don't like both the parents are working. And that's another thing too. Like when both parents are working and then you decide I'm going to quit, you'll work, I'll homeschool. Like that's a really big change for some parents.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's gonna be a complicated issue. And when, like you were saying, when there's one side who says just get rid of all the guns and no more shooting, but then it's like, well, I need to keep my guns because I have to defend the government from doing whatever they're gonna do to me or whatever, or they feel like they feel that way.
Hmm.
Like how would you even approach that? It's like with the abortion issue. Like how would you, when one's like end abortion, and no one's like, no, we got to keep abortion for reproductive rights or whatever. Those two conversations right there are just, I don't see them ending anytime soon. And it's always going to be both sides of the aisle are going to use that. I mean, I have my own opinions on that. I definitely don't like abortion. I want it ended. And I definitely
Hmm.
think you should have a gun if you feel like you need to have a gun and you train and learn how to use it. But I also know that there's millions of other people who don't agree with me. So like, what do you do with that?
Well, exactly. So that's exactly what I was talking about a second ago. Is that's why a restoration of federalism would fix a lot of these, at least societal and cultural issues. Jeff Dyston wrote an article fairly recently that was right after when the whole leak happened, where they were saying, "Oh, it looks like SCOTUS may overturn Roe v. Wade," and the article wasn't really even so much about that as it was about healthy federalism fixes this. The reason why you don't have a bigger push for people trying to restore federalism, in short, the overwhelming majority of things, as the Constitution is written, being handled at the state level, is because since we have not enjoyed federalism in any meaningful sense for many, many years, that essentially makes everything that happens at the federal level winner take all, right? If your president wins with 50.1% of the vote, or whatever, if you get a majority in the House or Senate, which ultimately then means that you can then appoint your Supreme Court justices, and the Supreme Court, of course, again, not serving the function that it was constitutionally delegated to serve, it's now a super legislature. The Supreme Court was supposed to be a court that oversaw only a limited scope of things, because again, the individual states had purview over the overwhelming majority of issues. But now, today, the Supreme Court is a super legislature that everyone defers to, including the president, the executive, and the legislative branches. And so, since you have this sort of winner-take-all system that is completely located, centralized in D.C., then it's totally natural for people to politic the way they do. They have to win. They have to get that ring of power, right? Because if they don't, then they're going to have other people's views forced upon them. Whereas in a federalist system, look, I think abortion is wrong. I don't think that abortion should be legal anywhere. But if abortion, because overturning Roe v. Wade doesn't get rid of abortion, that just sends it back to the states. That's all that does. Are they still going to have abortions in San Francisco? Boy, you bet they will. There is absolutely nothing I can do about that from here in Tennessee. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying I can do much of anything that happens in Tennessee either, but at least you can vote with your feet, and we're just going to have to agree to live in a world where people in Alabama are going to have to be content with Alabama being a state that is a reflection of their culture and values. And people in California are going to have to be content that California is a reflection of their culture and values, and not try to force those cultures and values upon the other. To be fair, quite frankly, it's the Californians way more likely wanting to enforce their values on the Alabamans, not the other way around. But I'm not even picking sides. I'm just saying that's what federalism is. We're going to have to agree to that system. And this will be a little bit of a controversial one too. Guns should be the same way. The U.S. Constitution was never understood to mean that because the Second Amendment says, thou shalt not infringe. That doesn't mean that your state can't infringe upon your gun rights, because that would be up to your state's constitution. The U.S. Constitution means that the federal government can't infringe upon your right to bear arms. So if we were truly understanding the federalist perspective, we would want to rip those things out root and branch so that all of those issues return to the states, and then individual states could decide. Again, is that perfect? No. Would there still be abortions? Yes. Would there still be people going door to door taking people's guns? In that scenario, probably. In places I don't want to live, they would want to do that. It's not something that Milton Friedman used to say. Is Nirvana is not meant for this world. There's no system that you and I could come up with that's going to satisfy our sensibilities on our definitions of freedom and liberty that would not still require what my friend Mike Meharry says is the LEOs, Liberty Enforcement Officers. Even if for you and I to get everything we want and to make everyone else do it, it would still require violence, because there are people out there that do not hold liberty as a primary political virtue and would not be happy with the way you and I would want to structure the world. So we're going to have to restore federalism, take the overwhelming majority of things out of the hand of the federal government, restore it to the states. Perhaps the overturn of Roe v. Wade would just be one small piece. I will add as a one small addendum to that, since you had talked a little bit about how people's minds have maybe been slanted a little bit during the pandemic era as well. Same rule applies. If there's a silver lining here, I'll give you a silver lining. If there's a silver lining here, because a lot of people as recently as the start of 2020 would have said federalism's dead. There's no point in fighting it. It's over. Incorporation doctrine's here. We're just going to have to go politic in DC because nothing your state says matters anymore. COVID taught us that federalism's not totally dead. And the way it did is that not every state was equal during the pandemic, were they? There were some states that you probably would have preferred not live. Even to this very day, some places are bringing masks back right now because cases went back up. And there were other states, I'm very thankful to say Tennessee was one of them, where they basically never had a state mandated mask or lockdown. Now, a state like Tennessee, for example, actually took federalism to the next level, to a state level, which was the governor said, I'm not going to require any of these things because that's not my power to do, but individual cities and counties could. Now, surprise, surprise, the bluest city and counties in Tennessee, Memphis, Nashville, Knoxville, they locked down and had masks. You know what? The other 98% of Tennessee there was nothing. I never wore a mask. I never wore a mask a single time. I've never worn a mask my whole life, and I'm never going to, other than Halloween. So I could enjoy that without an enormous hassle to my life because I live here. I would not have been able to enjoy that quite so easily if I lived in New York, could I? So you know what? Maybe federalism's not dead after all.
Yeah, I was just thinking, could you imagine if like the Supreme Court was in DC or whatever, and then the White House was in like Los Angeles, and then the Congress was somewhere like, I don't know, Dallas, Texas or something like that. They're like, okay, you have to go here. And then if you want to go here, you have to travel to Dallas. And if you want to go to there, you got to go to LA. I don't know. That'd be kind of funny if that was how it laid out. But obviously, like you said, they're all coagulated in one little area. So